Hello there, and a very warm welcome to Classeek 15. This the podcast hub of insider advice for young and emerging classical musicians. A sort of digital university, if you like, with industry insiders as your guides. I'm Jack Pepper, I'm a composer and radio presenter, and together we get to enjoy a 15-minute virtual coffee with classical stars and insiders. Today I'm going to introduce you to Jo Wilson, an experienced radio, music streaming and record industry pro. She's worked with some of the biggest commercial groups in the world, from Bauer Media and Global on the radio side, to EMI, Warner Classics and Universal Music Group on the record label side. For over a decade, she worked at Classic FM, including as an executive producer. She was then a senior manager for Classics A&R at EMI Music, the label manager for Champs Hill Records, and then the senior manager for recordings at Warner Classical. And we have worked together very closely at Scala Radio, where I present, and Jo is our head of music. She was one of the launch team when the station debuted back in 2019, becoming the UK's third national classical music radio station. Well, we spoke on a video call, and Jo began by explaining what it means to be a radio station's head of music. What is top of the job description?
Well, it's managing the playlist, really, is essentially the key to it all, or the hub of it all. It's choosing what new releases we're going to play, keeping an eye on the sort of overall policy and checking it's in line with what the sort of brief of the station is meant to be. So without going into too much detail on Scala, obviously we play our classical music and we play, as you know, bits of show tunes and sort of folk and classical fusion and all kinds of different things. So actually it's a really interesting, diverse mix, and it's been quite, fun kind of getting to grips with that. And so, yes, you have to keep an eye on what the mix is, but also boring things like rotation rules and all of that kind of thing. Plus, I suppose I'm the sort of go-to point for other sort of elements of the station, parts of the business, whether that be if we're doing live concerts and we sort of need to decide what the music's going to be for those. We published a book a couple of years ago, so I was sort of involved, consulted on that sort of thing. So it's really interesting. And sort of, obviously there's just the day-to-day stuff as well, like scheduling and PRS reports and those sorts of things. But yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell.
And so what would you say, apart from obviously having to work with me, would you say is the toughest part of the job, the thing you find most challenging?
I suppose it's, I'm very lucky to be in a job where I get to listen to music all the time. I suppose that it can be difficult to sort of take a step back a bit and think how much of this is something that I like and how much of it is actually right for the station, and kind of striking that balance. I mean, hopefully I've sort of got okay at it, but yeah, there's also with Scala we play quite a lot of contemporary and new music, so more so than your traditional kind of classical station. So there is in a traditional sort of way you'll see what the new releases are, for example, and you'll see that it's a Beethoven piano concerto by a world-renowned pianist, and without even listening to it, I mean, obviously you would still listen to it, but you know that it's going to work for the station, whereas we have an awful lot of music which is new, and that's really interesting, makes the job really interesting, but also there's a lot of it, so, trying to get through it all, and as I said earlier, how to really kind of take a little bit of a step back. You want to kind of have the impact of the music, but take a bit of a step back and think, right, where does this fit on the Scala spectrum?
So what is it that catches your ear in a new release? What is it that jumps out at you that makes you think, yes, I will playlist this?
So I guess you're looking for, it could be a number of things, but sort of some of them are obviously star names, and I mean, I'll sort of run off a list. So you've got your star names, you've got core classical repertoire that the audience knows and loves. But then you've also got more interesting, either unknown repertoire that's new but sort of works for Scala. So as you know, Scala, we aim to be accessible while still being interesting. So we will play new music, but we won't play anything that's going to be too squeaky gate kind of thing. Although occasionally we do. And then also I'm really interested in coming across music that sort of new takes on familiar repertoire and that fuses the genres a little bit. So, for example, I think you've played it. We've got the Bryn Terfel released a Tevel forgive me, released a lovely album recently of folk songs, sea songs it was called, and that's the sort of, and that was new clever arrangements, and he had some guests on it, including Simon Keenlyside and then Sting. And I mean, that's perfect because it's Bryn Terfel, one of the biggest pop singers in the world, doing this, a new take on some really interesting repertoire. So that kind of thing is great. And then also new, young, up and coming artists. You know, it's one of the things we're keen to do. So it's finding those, and for that you just have to obviously use your ears, but you also have to trust what the PRs and the labels are telling you when they're, you know, saying, no, this one really is good, and you need to keep an eye on.
Is there a particular type of artist that you feel you see a lot of, or indeed, you know, that could be in a bad way or in a good way? Is there a particular type of artist that is particularly appealing, or indeed maybe less appealing to a radio station?
I suppose there's a prevalence of, because there is a demand for it, your kind of contemporary ambient piano, solo piano music. And I understand why there is, because it's more really about the Spotifys and things like that because of the piano playlists are, you know, proven that they do amazingly well, the amount of listeners that those kind of playlists get. And, you know, we have our own little sort of peaceful piano slots on Scala as well. But there's the number, the amount of stuff that's out there in comparison with the amount that can be played is sort of disproportionate. And then the other kind of thing that I do wonder where its audience is, where it gets played, where it gets featured. There's quite a bit of it's not really, it's what you might have called crossover back in the day, but crossover I don't think these days doesn't really work as a term, because there's crossover everywhere. Do you know what I mean? But crossover in the sense we used to call it. So I mean, cheesy would be the word for it, or those kinds of recordings where, I don't know, the artist, it's a slightly classical style, but done in a very pop way, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. And there are a few of those out there, and I kind of think these days, not many of those get through, unless they've got really strong PR behind them, or there is actually something uniquely good or different about them. There's more of those than I think will, you know, get through the sort of break through the what's the word make a mark, I suppose. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else, actually. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I always find the actual point of contact quite interesting, how an album or how an artist is actually sort of packaged, if we put it bluntly, to you. Everything from the pictures to the kind of the headline. And actually, I've noticed a lot of press releases can be very, very long. And it sort of assumes that you're going to read an entire history of an artist, when actually that should be just to get through the door. That should be the headline. It's the equivalent of a headline in a newspaper rather than the full article. The full article to me is the recording, actually. Then the recording does the talking. What do you feel labels or artists could do better? Is there like a bugbear that you think, I wish they would only do this, or they could only change that in terms of that maybe approach, the way they sort of pitch themselves? What do you wish you had more of, or less of?
Or less of. I mean, well, for me, I don't know if this is a subjective thing, but because there's not, it's, you know, obviously there are so many labels, as I sort of mentioned earlier, that some actually serve me quite well, as it were, and others could do other things sort of slightly differently. So, you know, it's just, it seems so simple when you're on this side. And having worked at labels before, I kind of know how they work too. So I know that it is possible to do what I would like them to be doing. So it's just, you know, it's the slightly dull things. It's giving enough notice. It's because I'll quite often get emails on the day of release, and, you know, we tend to, it sort of makes most sense somehow to feature new releases when they're coming out rather than the following week, or, you know, being a bit late with it. And yeah, and as you say, sort of giving a great sort of short summary, flagging what the highlights are, what the unique selling point is about this release, why we should be interested, why it works for Scala. And then just, you know, providing everything on time in a timely fashion. And also, it's not just about playing new releases. You know, we have other things. We have live sessions that we do. We have, as I mentioned, you know, we do live concerts and so on. And so I've built it's improved actually, because we've been building up the relationships for the last 5 years. But them knowing to if they've got a key release coming out, and the artist or a key artist that they're launching, to flag that sort of stuff up well in advance, because then, if we're planning a concert well in advance, we can get involved with that, So some are better than others, and I don't know if I should name check, but one of my favourites is Signum. They're very, very good at their information. It comes sort of nice and early, plenty of time. Not too early, because then I'll probably lose the email, but it comes in plenty of time, and it comes with, the audio, the press release, the booklet, it's all there, and so I know it's possible. So for those others who don't quite manage it, come on, guys.
Well, you have a unique perspective, though, because you allude to your own background with labels, Warner Classics, Universal EMI, as well. So you've seen from both angles of the door, if you like. What have you noticed has changed over the years from your perspective in the record industry, but also in radio and dealing with record labels? What would you say is the biggest change in that time that you've noticed?
I think, one which I've sort of said before, really, is certainly the volume of releases and the amount of entities there are releasing albums and singles, the amount of sort of smaller labels, independent labels that there are, that are producing, that there are, but they are also producing really good stuff. There've always been small independent labels, but they'd come through and they'll have sort of slightly dodgy cover art and just be a bit ramshackle. But these days, everyone is really, it's so much easier to do that with the technology, to actually produce really good quality stuff. So there's more. That's one key thing. I'm trying to think from a record label point of view. I was in the kind of A&R area rather than the sort of PR plugging to radio stations and so on. It's been a few years since I've been there, and really this wasn't a change. I think for labels it's tough to get the money to make a good recording, and to because one of the jobs I did, I worked partly in planning A&R, so sort of what might be on the record essentially, and then partly in the kind of actual production management of it. So sort of allocating budget to things, and it was quite restrictive in a lot of ways. But yeah, so I don't know if that's improved. We know why they're struggling, because the sort of the sales of actual albums and the income issue with Spotify and digital service providers. So that doesn't really answer your question, because I think that's a sort of constant, and I'd be interested to see how they're getting on now, because actually particularly EMI Classics and Warner Classics, which is the same thing essentially, because one became the other, I've really noticed from what I'm receiving from them now, a kind of upturn. It's sort of, I think it can often have something to do with just who's in charge, and how they work, because often with the majors, they're part of a massive, bit like Scala, we're owned by a large company, they're owned by a large company, and often us in the classical world, we have to fight our corner quite a lot, and I think maybe they're doing that better, and so therefore perhaps they're being allocated more resources. That's speculation, obviously. But
what did you learn from being in a record label that is useful now? What would you say was the kind of takeaway lesson, maybe, that's still helpful to you today? Well, I don't know if this is a lesson so much as just I really found it was really interesting insights that I got to the artistry of making a recording. And that's not just the artists performing. I was sort of lucky enough to go along to some of these sessions. Witnessing them is impressive, but also witnessing the work of the record producers. It's just incredible. I don't know if you've ever sat in on that kind of thing. You probably could do it yourself, Jack. But just watching these guys with their and girls with their scores, and the musician will play a movement or a segment of what they're playing, and then kind of come and listen back. And I've just sat in the recording room and watched them kind of marking up this incredibly complex score sometimes. Like, how do you hear all of this? How are you doing all this? And then I'll do some name checking, because there's Stephen Johns, who's still producing now. He worked at EMI actually, and then he's been at the Royal College for a while. I think he's stepping back to get back to more producing, because he loves doing it. Andrew Cornell's another one, John Fraser. I sort of, so yes, sitting in on all of them, and people like Ian Bostridge and Kyung-Hwa Chung, I got to sort of sit in on these sessions and just see these minds and think, wow, because you tend to
or maybe it's just me, one tends to think, you see these musicians, well, they just practice every day, and you kind of forget when you haven't done it for a while, because obviously I studied music and I used to play, but it's been a while since I've done it properly, and certainly didn't carry it on. So just getting that insight into the depth of knowledge really and skill that they have. I mean, that's such a sort of naive thing to say, but really seeing it in action like that was, kind of quite breathtaking sometimes.
Yeah, it sounds obvious, but it's an incredibly musical process for the producer. The ears they have, as an equal to the ears of the conductor, the things that they can pick up on, a single note or a single little bit of intonation. But I think the takeaway point is also that the skills that you learn, as you say, you studied music, that the things that you learn, you apply in different ways, and that might not be as a performer, but you are using those skills. So just finally, Joe, what would you say is the most important thing for a young artist listening to keep in mind if they're looking to do more of this, to be played on the radio, say, to get more exposure? What's the most important thing they can keep in mind, the most important practical things they can do as first next steps?
I mean, I think it sounds like a cliche, but I think sometimes cliches are cliches because they're true, and it's been the case since I was young. I mean, I decided I didn't want to perform, just didn't think I was up to it really when I was still at university. But I think it applies in whatever part of music you want to work in, that you either, you basically talk to whoever you can talk to. Networking is hugely important. And it doesn't have to, when you say networking, it can sound like a bit of a sort of, I don't know, an intimidating thing if you're just starting out. But it doesn't have to be schmoozing with big cheeses. It can be just going to a concert, going to an event at your college, going to talk to people and just meeting and chatting to people, and because you never know who knows anyone else, or what idea might be sparked just by having that conversation with people. And then I'd also say just inhale information, depending on what your line of interest is. Just get familiar with what the radio stations are playing, what podcasts are out there. Listen to podcasts like yours, obviously, and just sort of inhale it, because that's by just taking in all that information. I think it helps spark ideas as to it might change the kind of thing you want to be doing, or it might think, I could try this. I hadn't thought of speaking to that person, or maybe I would want to play there, and so really. Inhale information, listen to lots of stuff, talk to lots of people would be my suggestion.
Inhale Classeek 15 is your advice there.
Yes.
Inhale Jack Pepper.
Inhale Jack Pepper and Scala Radio, obviously.
Of course.
Yes.
Well, Joe Wilson, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
And I will see you in the office.
Yes, I'll see you then.
And I really hope to see you again for another Classeek 15 very soon. The whole series is available on the usual podcast platforms and online at classeek.com. There you can also find all of Classeek's news, opportunities, their online concert series and video on demand. And while you are in front of a screen, don't forget to follow @Classeek Music on social media for an up-to-the-second update. Thank you so much for joining me, and until the next time, enjoy the music.